So tonight's extract comes for those who, particularly on a Saturday afternoon like this one, find themselves missing village cricket. This comes from the novel England, There England by A G Macdonell. The extract tells of a village cricket match and, in my mind, is the best and funniest description of village cricket that I've ever read. At 20 minutes to 3, Mr Hodge had completed his rather tricky negotiations with the Fordenden captain and had arranged that 2 substitutes should be lent by Fordenden in order that the visitors should field 11 men and that 9 men on each side should bat. But just as the 2 men on the Fordenden side, who had been detailed for the unpleasant duty of fielding for both sides and batting for neither, had gone off home in high dudgeon, a motor car arrived, containing not only Mr Hodge's 2 defaulters, but a 3rd gentleman in flannels as well, who swore stoutly that he had been invited by Mr Hodge to play, and affirmed that he was jolly well going to play. Whoever stood down, it wasn't going to be him. Negotiations therefore had to be reopened. The pair of local Achilles had to be recalled, and at 10 minutes to 3, the match began upon a 12-a-side basis. Mr Hodge, having won the toss by a system of his own, founded upon differential calculus and the Copernican theory, sent in his opening pair to bat. One was James Livingstone, a very sound club cricketer, and the other one was called, simply, Boone. Boone was a huge, awe-inspiring colossus of a man, weighing at least 18 stone and wearing all the majestic trappings of a Cambridge blue. Donald felt that it was hardly fair to loose such cracks upon a humble English village until he fortunately remembered that he, of all people, a foreigner, admitted by courtesy to the national game, ought not to set himself up to be a judge of what is, and what is not, cricket. The Fordenden team ranged themselves at the bidding of their captain, the Fordenden baker, in various spots of vantage amid the daisies, buttercups, dandelions, vetches, thistledown, and clumps of dark red sorrel, and the blacksmith, having taken in, just for luck as it were, yet another reef in his snake buckle belt, prepared to open the attack. It so happened that at the end at which he was to bowl, the ground behind the wicket was level for a few yards, and then sloped away rather abruptly, so that it was only during the last 3 or 4 yards of his intensive, galvanic run that the blacksmith, who took a long run, was actually visible to the batsman, or indeed to anyone on the field of play, except the man stationed in the deep field behind him. This man saw nothing of the game at all, except the blacksmith walking back dourly, and the blacksmith running up ferociously, and occasionally a ball driven smartly over the brow of the hill in his direction. The sound cub player, having taken guard, having twiddled his bat round several times in a nonchalant manner, and having stared arrogantly at each fieldsman in turn, was somewhat surprised to find that, although the field was ready, no bowler was visible. His doubts, however, were resolved a second or 2 later, when the blacksmith came up, breasting the slope superbly like a metal-stone combination of Vulcus and Venus. The first ball which he delivered was a high, full pitch to leg of appalling velocity. It must have lighted upon a bare patch among the long grass near Long Leg, for it rocketed, first bounce, into the hedge, and 4 byes were reluctantly signalled by the village umpire. The row of gaffers on the rustic bench shook their heads and agreed that it was many years since 4 byes had been signalled on that ground, and called for more pints of old and mild. The other members of Mr Hodge's team blanched visibly and called for more pints of bitter. The youngish professor of ballistics, who was in next, muttered something about muzzle velocities and started to do a sum on the back of an envelope. The second ball went full pitch into the wicket-keeper's stomach, and there was a delay while the deputy wicket-keeper was invested with the pads and gloves of office. The third ball, making a noise like a partridge, would have hummed past Mr Livingstone's left ear had he not dexterously stuck it out the ground for 6, and the fourth took his leg bail with a bullet-like full pitch. 10 runs for 1 wicket. Last man, 6. The professor got the 5th ball on his left ear and went back to the 3 horseshoes, while Mr Harcourt had the singular misfortune to hit his wicket before the 6th ball was even delivered. 10 runs for 2 wickets, and 1 man retired hurt. A slow left-hand bowler was on at the other end, the local rate collector, a man whose whole life was one of infinite patience and guile. Off his first ball, the massive Cambridge blue was easily stumped, having executed a movement that aroused the professional admiration of the ancient who was leaning upon his scythe. Donald was puzzled that so famous a player could play so execrable a shot, until it transpired later on that a wrong impression had been created, and that the portentous Boone had gained his blue at Cambridge for rowing, and not for cricket. 10 runs for 3 wickets, and 1 man hurt. The next player was a singular young man. He was small and quiet, and he wore perfectly creased white flannels, white silk socks, a pale pink silk shirt, and a white cap. On the way down, he had taken little part in the conversation and even less in the beer drinking. There was a retiring modesty about him that made him conspicuous in that cricket 11. And there was a gentleness, an almost finicky gentleness, about his movements, which hardly seemed virile and athletic. He looked as if a fast ball would knock the bat out of his hands. Donald asked someone what his name was and was astonished to learn that he was actually a famous novelist. Just as this celebrity, holding his bat as delicately as if it was a flute or a fan, was picking his way through the daisies and thistledown towards the wicket, Mr. Hodge rushed anxiously, tankard in hand, from the 3 horseshoes and bellowed in a most unpoetical voice, "Play carefully, Bobby! You keep your end up! Runs don't matter!" "Very well, Bill," replied Mr. Southcott sedately. Donald was interested by this little exchange. It was the team spirit at work. The captain instructing his man to play a certain type of game that was demanded by the state of the team's fortunes, and the individual loyalty suppressing his instincts to play a different type of game. The novelist took guard modestly, glanced furtively round the field as if it were an impertinence to suggest that he would survive long enough to make a study of the fieldsman's positions worthwhile, and hit the rate collector's first ball over the 3 horseshoes into a hayfield. The ball was retrieved by a mob of screaming urchins, handed back to the rate collector, who scratched his head, and then bowled a fast Yorker, which Mr. Southcott hit into the salon bar of his shoes, giving Mr. Harcourt such a fright that he required several pints before he fully recovered his nerve. The next ball was very slow and crafty, endowed as it was with every iota of finger spin and brain power which a long-service rate collector could muster. In addition, it was delivered at the extreme end of the crease, so as to secure a background of dark laurels instead of a dazzling white screen, and it swung a little in the air. A few moments later, the urchins, by this time delirious with ecstasy, were fishing it out of the squire's trout stream with a bamboo pole and an old bucket. The rate collector was bewildered. He had never known such a travesty of a game. It was not cricket, it was slogging. It was wild, unscientific bashing, and furthermore his reputation was in grave danger. The instalments would be harder than ever to collect, and heaven knew they were hard enough to collect as it was, what with bad times and all. His 3 famous deliveries had been treated with contempt: the leg break, the fast Yorker, and the slow swinging off break out of the laurel bushes. What on earth was he to try now? Another 6 and he'd be laughed out of the parish. Fortunately, the village umpire came out of a trance of consternation and came to the rescue. 38 years of umpiring for the Fordenden Cricket Club had taught him a thing or two, and he called "over" firmly and marched off to square leg. The rate collector was glad to give way to a free forester who had been specially imported for the match. He was only a moderate bowler, but it was felt it was worthwhile giving him a trial, if only for the sake of the scarf round his waist and his cap. At the other end, the fast bowler pounded away grimly until an unfortunate accident occurred. Mr. Southcott had been treated with apologetic contempt for those of his deliveries which came within reach, and the blacksmith temper had been rising for some time. An urchin had shouted, "Take him off!" and the other urchins, for whom Mr. Southcott was by now a firmly established deity, had screamed with delight. The captain had held 1 or 2 ominous consultations with the wicket-keeper and other advisers, and the blacksmith knew that his dismissal was at hand, unless he produced a supreme effort. It was the last ball of the over. He halted at the wicket before going back for his run, glared at Mr. Harcourt, who had been driven out to umpire by his colleagues, greatly to the regret of Mr. Batsmen, the landlord of the shoes, glared at Mr. Southcott, took another reef in his belt, shook out another inch in his braces, spat on his hand, swung his arm 3 or 4 times in a meditative sort of way, grasped the ball tightly in his colossal palm, and then turned smartly about and marched off like a Pomeranian grenadier and vanished over the brow of the hill. Mr. Southcott, during these proceedings, leant elegantly on his bat and admired the view. At last, After a long stillness, the ground shook. The grasses waved violently. Small birds arose with shrill clamours. A loud puffing sound alarmed the butterflies, and the blacksmith, looking more like Venus than ever, came thundering over the crest of a hill. The world held its breath. Among the spectators, conversation was suddenly hushed. Even the urchins, understanding somehow that they were assisting in a crisis in affairs, were silent for a moment as the mighty figure swept up to the crease. But alas for human ambitions. Mr. Harcourt, swaying slightly from leg to leg, had understood the menacing glare of the bowler, had marked the preparation for a titanic effort, and, for he was not a poet for nothing, knew exactly what was going on. And Mr. Harcourt, sober, had a very pleasant sense of humour. But Mr. Harcourt, rather drunk, was a purposed demon of impishness. Sober, he occasionally resisted a temptation to try to be funny. Rather drunk, never. As the giant whirlwind of volcanic energy rushed past him to the crease, Mr. Harcourt, quivering with excitement and internal laughter and wobbling uncertainly upon his pins, took a deep breath and bellowed, "No ball!" It was too late for the unfortunate bowler to stop himself. The ball flew out of his hand like a bullet and hit Third Slip, who was not looking, full pitch on the kneecap. With a yell of agony, Third Slip began hocking about like a stork until he tripped over a tussock of grass and fell on his face in a bed of nettles, from which he sprung up again with another drum-spitting yell. The blacksmith himself was flung forward by his own irresistible momentum, startled out of his wits by Mr. Harcourt's bellow in his ear, and thrown off his balance by his desperate effort to prevent himself from delivering the ball, and the result was that his gigantic feet got mixed up along with each other, and he fell heavily in the centre of the wicket, knocking up a cloud of dust and dandelion seed and twisting his ankle. Rooks by hundreds arose in protest from the vicarage cedars. The urchins howled like intoxicated banshees. The gaffers gaped. Mr. Southcott gazed modestly at the ground. Mr. Harcourt gazed modestly at the heavens. Mr. Harcourt did not think the world had ever been, or could ever be again, such a capital place, even though he had laughed internally so much that he got the hiccups.